The National Economic Development and Labour Council, Nedlac's 28th Annual National Summit has wrapped up at the Gallagher estate, as you've heard from Gallagher. The summit provides an opportunity for social partners from organised business, community government and organised labour to receive and consider a report on the activities of the institution. Isobel Frye, Executive Director for Social Policy Initiative, joins me now. Isobel, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, the summit comes more than a year after the partners failed, essentially, just to hammer out a social compact to address a runaway unemployment and slow economic growth. When will we start seeing an implementable social compact, especially from government, as has been promised on numerous occasions, I might say, by President Cyril Ramaphosa?
Good afternoon, Anashi. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a historic summit to my many years of attending, particularly because social partners were quite honest in their reflections as to what had been achieved and what hadn't been achieved. As you said, there have been promises about a social compact from the president, and the president has used Nedlac very successfully in the past when he was deputy president in terms of moving, for instance, the national minimum wage bill into an act and into an implementation. So he knows the strengths of negotiating. And your question is then, why has nothing come through? And that's a really valid question. What came out for me as part of community constituency today was a reflection that there is not a deep consensus. And in fact, it was a statement made by one of the main panelists to say we need to address the elephant in the room, and that is that there are deep ideological differences between social partners. Now, we've just heard Cas Cuvadio, who's the convener for business, actually suggesting that maybe there should be negotiations outside of Nedlac, the bilateral position that he was mentioning between business and government. Now, we find that's really, really dangerous, because if you are trying to get a social compact that has a national ownership behind it, you can't break down into bilaterals. Bilaterals are there when you reach we can't get beyond a certain point, and there's a logjam. Then you have bilaterals to try and negotiate away, mediate and arbitrate away beyond that. So I think to an extent, the concern about a lack of social compact needs to be addressed in the strength that Nedlac has. The other position that community constituencies had for a very long time, and this comes really with a warning for the MTBPS, the medium-term budget policy statement coming next month in October, is that when the state is effectively heralding that there'll be austerity budgeting, that there'll be a cut to the social wage, that really undermines the fabric of democracy in terms of the social contract that the state has with citizens. So if that is being weakened, and then the question is, can we have social compacts? It's as if the main principle of agreement and commitment has been weakened. And I think that's where we need to look at. And for that reason, Nedlac itself, as a social dialogue platform, is even more important. But the successes that have happened in the past, the really great work around COVID, where the rapid response task team, we met initially every day, was just really important, and that we need to go back to.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get to those successes and the solutions, I mean, one of the things that is very refreshing to hear from you is that this was a historic meeting by Nedlac, because as social partners, you've really reflected and have been really honest about just some of the crisis that is on the ground and is affecting South Africa negatively, I might add. But then you hear statements from, for instance, the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, in his address saying that, South Africa has inherited a labor force that is characterized by racial and gender inequalities as well as skills shortages. It does kind of put a dampener on things because, yes, that is a reality, but we have had decades to try and address those those inequalities that have been left by the apartheid government. When you hear that coming out from government, how confident should we be then that this, social compact is going to exist within a couple of months or years, for that matter?
Again, that was a really a very helpful question. And to answer that, I do go back to what Cascavedia was saying about Nedlac isn't necessarily the place where that happens. So if you see a failure in terms of skills development and the linkage between skills and the labour market and the industrial policy needs, for instance, Nedlac is not the place where that happens. That definitely has to be the role of Parliament, parliamentary portfolio committees, calling line departments to account, to take them through what the strategic plan is, what the solutions are, and why those are not being achieved. That is governmental, departmental monitoring and evaluation. So we're at Nedlac, what we do is we forge and formulate new policies and come back and review policies. But the legwork has to be done by government, who is being held to account by the parliamentary structures. Your concern about the fact that we don't seem to have addressed those cleavages is incredibly important. One of the things that worried me to an extent, this is me wearing my researcher hat, is that recognition was made of the improvement in unemployment figures. And yet, in effect, the unemployment figures have not substantially improved. I mean, what we saw was a quarterly shake-up, really, of a couple of 100,000 people moving in and out of unemployment, and yet we've got 12 million people. So they are stark crises, and as community, what we would like to see Nedlac being used for is to address the unemployment and the poverty as a matter of crisis, as COVID itself was a crisis, and bringing people together, because it seems that the emphasis that is being placed under the leadership of business is on economic reconstruction and development, whereas we're saying that basically people don't have enough to eat right now. We can't ask the poor to wait until the economy recovers. And so Nedlac has a much greater role to play in formulating those kinds of agreements on priorities, not in overseeing government in terms of it achieving and doing what it should be doing.
Now, when we start looking at what possibly will come out of this report following this meeting this year, and just talking about solutions in terms of just some of the various crises that were announced, during the summit, like low economic growth, elevated levels of inflation, high unemployment. One of the speakers actually also mentioned that, government, businesses, and social society civil society is very quick to agree on, the short-term kind of solutions, but never really the systematic and the systemic long-term solutions that you want to address those long-standing challenges. What do you hope will come out of this meeting that will characterize in fundamental changes happening?
The point about systemic challenges and problems is something that we need to address, because you can have photo opportunities and short-term gains, as you mentioned, and yet you come back to the fact that you have the same structural problems. One of the points that we've tabled time and time again is that under the current macroeconomic framework of targeting debt and inflation, we effectively are seeing the economy being stifled. We've been calling for a macroeconomic framework that instead targets unemployment and growth, and using government policies and using state expenditure in order to address that. So rather than shrinking by taking money out of the economy through inflation targeting and interest rates, we need to be crowding in. And we've consistently said that the use of universal basic income is a way to make sure that everybody has the money. So we would like to see the Nedlac system over the next 12 to 24 months tackle those items which are the big, really the large umbrella items, without tackling the macroeconomic framework, which has failed us consistently for the last 28 years. We're not going to be able to look at fundamental reform. All that we'll be doing is tweaking at the margins, as we have been with the unemployment figures. We don't know whether Nedlac has got the appetite to do that. That would really need a big consensus amongst the political leadership of the different social partners. But as you say, until that happens, the best that we can hope for is marginal improvement and marginal growth. Of course, another elephant in the room was the elections next year, and the question of how political competitors would be using the current challenges in order to try and win the electorate coming forward. mention was made of a coalition government, and if that happened, how Nedlac, for instance, would work around that. So I think that there are interesting times, and I think people are acknowledging that the historical trajectories and also the historical power balances are not ongoing. But within the various shake-ups that were contemplated as part of the crises and the political uncertainties going forward, we need to know that the certainties that the infrastructure of state delivery is improved and better. And in fact, the gift of the giver speaker was just emphasizing the lack of preparedness that government has often as sort of frontline defenders. I think you can take that as a metaphor as well as at a political level. Do we have a leadership that is able to act swiftly, to identify the priorities, and to realize that things have to be done in a certain sequencing? The first sequencing needs to be making sure that people have enough to eat, there's food on the table. That will lead to an economic freeing up and job creation as people are able to demand. And that can only happen if the macroeconomic framework is something which is reevaluated in an incredibly serious manner, taking into account what's happening in different parts of the world as well.
Isobel, thank you so much. You've said a mouthful, very key, important points there. One has to then wait and see if we will actually see action on the ground. As you say, there are lots of elephants in the room. Thank you so much for your time.